Well, good evening, everyone. See if I can get this going here. So my lesson is on Proverbs. A couple of weeks ago, Cindy Eckert had asked me, he's like, Jeff, what's the title of your class? And it kind of, I don't know, threw me off for some reason. It was like, Proverbs. And it's like, no special title or anything. It's like, no, just Proverbs. Well, she was making the bulletin board up there and has it all nice and neat up there. And then I started thinking, I was like, oh, think of all the cool names I could come up with for Proverbs. Good grief. So then as I was putting my PowerPoint together and trying to come up with a little picture slide, and this showed up, and I thought, okay, this is perfect, the way of wisdom. So, but then I just thought of all these, and even as I go through tonight, they'll be like, oh, I could have called the class this, Proverbs, words of the wise, or all this kind of stuff. But I think this kind of gives an idea of where I want to go with this class, and it kind of represents where I want to take this study of Proverbs, which is basically, from what I'm taking of it, is Solomon provides us or shows us the way of two paths, the path of wisdom and the path of folly, or the path of the fool. And especially the first 9 chapters, what is kind of somewhat the introduction part of the book of Psalm or Proverbs, is focusing on wisdom and the way of the wise versus the way of the fool. And we'll spend about our first 3 lessons kind of concentrating on that and concentrating on wisdom. And then my idea for the next classes after that is I'm going to do more of a topical study, and there's so much application in the book of Proverbs and specific application, and so that's kind of my idea of where I'll go with it. In general, we'll talk about wisdom, and then probably the first 3 lessons and the next 6 lessons are going to be more topical, all taken from the various Proverbs. So it's not going to be a chapter by chapter, verse by verse kind of study. And Proverbs is, definitely in my research I saw studies done that way, but it's not a typical one that lends itself towards that, because there's no real plot in Proverbs, there's no real storyline, there's not any real characters. It's not as we're looking at the Exodus and Moses' plight through, the Exodus of Egypt and all that kind of stuff, or the plight of the forefathers and Abraham. And so it's kind of the first book in the Bible that it has a total different design to it. And so that's why I want to address it this way, is kind of, like I said, after I get over the primary stuff of the key of what the book is regarding wisdom, and then we'll get into some more topical stuff. And then I have a confession I have to make too. I just taught this in the junior high and high school class, okay? But it's not verbatim. I changed it up just a little bit to bring it up to your guys' level. Just kidding. Mitch had asked me to teach the high school class, and you know what? I feel bad because Mitch has asked me. I was like, Mitch, I'm the kind of guy that I can't, I'm teaching the adult class. Well, I've done this several times now, and it's time to go. I've got kids in the high school class. I need to be in there. So as I was preparing this study, because usually while I'm up there last quarter, I'm already deep into what I'm going to do this time. And so it just kind of worked out as I was getting into this study of Proverbs. This isn't a book, it is, it's definitely, we're going to get into that in just a second. It's definitely a book for our youth, but it's also a book for us. And as you look at it, there's just so much practical application for us as adults in this book. So I've definitely revamped it and made some changes. This is not what I taught them by any means, but it gave me a good solid start for sure. So obviously the book was written by Solomon around 900 BC. Interesting thing about Solomon is he gets credit for writing the book, but he also gives credit where credit is due. So there's some other people to recognize in here, and I don't know a whole lot about them, but if you look at chapter 30, it says the words of Agur. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Agur. I started to look them up, and I couldn't really find much on them. And then chapter 31 is accredited to King Lemuel. And neither one of these guys have a whole lot of stuff about them that I found worthwhile spending my time on, other than the idea that he does credit these words of chapter 30 and 31 to those two writers. And then in Proverbs, several times in Proverbs, particularly 22:17, it refers to sayings of the wise. So it's kind of assumed and considered that over the course of Solomon's life, that he had heard wise sayings from others. And obviously, I would imagine, obviously Solomon had put these together and had written these things down. And I think we could probably reason that every one of these little proverbs, and there's just hundreds and hundreds of them in here, because as we get into a minute, they're super short, and it's just kind of a blast. It's bam, 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 all the way through like 30 chapters. So I don't think Solomon sat down and coined every single one of these, but he does give credit where credit is due. So I asked that first question, and I wanted to spend just a brief moment tonight talking about Solomon, draw a couple things from him, because we don't talk about Solomon too much. We know he was the third king of Israel. He was the son of David. He reigned for 40 years. And then the one question I asked is, name something impressive about Solomon, or something that sticks out about Solomon to you. Do you guys have any right off the bat, Micah? Right, and word had got around, and the Queen of Sheba had heard about him and traveled from afar to come see this great wise king and his success. Definite. One of the key points that we're obviously going to get into is his wisdom, and world-renowned wisdom. And God said, "You will be the wisest and of all." So yeah, good, definitely, Micah. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really think about that, Jessica. And Jessica makes a good point that, God stated there in Proverbs that he was the wisest of all that time. And like I said, Jessica makes a good point that he probably really was the wisest person until the coming of Jesus. What other things stick out about Solomon? Oh, sorry. Okay, all right, and I think I know where you're going with that, and we'll get into it. He was very wise, but not always. Towards the end, and we think the common things. He built the temple, and one of the things that's interesting about him when he built the temple, and if you look in 1 Kings chapter 8, where you see the dedication to the temple, you can see Solomon's heart was truly dedicated to God. And I think if you look at Solomon in his early reign, there was true dedication to God. And if you look at how the process of the dedication of the temple, it was kind of an all-field occasion. There was numerous sacrifices, and then a big portion of chapter 8 there is dedicated to a prayer that Solomon says, a prayer that just overflows with faith and praise to the Lord. But I think the thing that stuck out to me most, that kind of is applicable to where a good point to make in this study, and is how he came about his wealth and his wisdom. And that takes me to my first slide. I have 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 through 14. And it says, Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what you wish me to give you." Then Solomon said, "You have shown great faithfulness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth, righteousness, uprightness of heart toward you, and you have reserved for him this great faithfulness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. And now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am like a little boy. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people whom are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is capable of judging the great people of yours? So there we see the Lord appears to Solomon in a dream and says, you're about to be king, what do you want? What help do you want? And I don't know, in my mind, the thing, if you think of someone granting you three wishes, and I'm about to go to the genie in the bottle, you can have three things. And where do our heads always go? Us, I want a new truck, I want this. Or that, you think of these possessions or these worldly things that we want. And that's kind of, there's a big difference between the illusion and dream of a genie in a bottle and the Lord appearing to you in a dream. I mean, I think if the Lord appeared to me in a dream, I think my request would be more spiritual. But I think as people, that worldly nature kind of thinks that, I want this, this, and this. And I'm kind of thinking Solomon would say, I'm king of this great nation. Well, I need wealth, Lord. I need power. I need to have respect. I need all this and this and this so I can run the kingdom of Israel. But he doesn't ask for that. He humbles himself and he humbly says, Lord, I need the wisdom to run this kingdom the way you want me to run it as a godly kingdom. And so if we go into the next part, I was impressed with his answer. Certainly God was impressed with it. And it says, now it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked for yourself a long life, nor have you asked for riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the lives of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice, behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. And kind of what Jessica was saying, as far as his wisdom and his level of wisdom until Christ came. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there not be any among you, any among the kings like you in all your days. And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. So God was pleased with Solomon's humble request to him. And God acknowledges that, grants Solomon the wisdom, but then goes above and beyond and says, good answer, Solomon. That's probably the key tool you're going to need to run this kingdom of Israel. But above and beyond, I'm going to give you something else too, because it's going to help. Here's some other tools that'll help you. Micah?
And like a key thing is that it's all conditional, because you can ask for something and think, well, I'm asking for all these things, but you can't forget the rest of it, because then you lose sight of what's really important. Because you can obtain something, and then you can lose sight of why and how you got it. If it was given to you by God, then you still have to follow and obey Him. All the other things are still going to be valued. But if that's conditional, then like God says at the end, if you walk in my ways, then you're gonna become like David, like your father, as far as establishing a godly kingdom.
Good point. And it kind of takes me to the next question is, what was Solomon's weakness or his downfall? Women. And you know what? I'm glad you said that way, because as we get into this study and some of this couple things we'll cover in 2 weeks, I believe, Solomon uses women as an example when he personifies wisdom. And we'll look a little bit at it tonight, but Solomon had a relationship with women where he even used them as tools of personification, I guess we can say, kind of in his study, or in the book of Proverbs. And we know it was his love for foreign women that was his fall. And what ultimately happened as a result of that? The kingdom was ultimately lost, right? And he no longer worshiped God exclusively, but he also worshiped other gods. 1 Kings 11:4 says his heart was not fully devoted to God, and he lost the kingdom. And like where Micah was going, he clearly had everything going on, and everything was going so good, but he forgot about verse 14. And if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commandments, and all of a sudden that slipped away from him, and then we see the fall. So, is it possible, is it possible for a man to have wisdom yet not use it? Right. And I think that's kind of where you were going with your comment, right? Because we know that Solomon was the wisest of all men, but he was led astray, and all of a sudden he's not using his wisdom anymore. So yeah, I do. I think it's possible for a man to have wisdom yet not to use it. And I think it's possible that it doesn't necessarily go away, but in moments of stumbling and in moments of weakness, all that wisdom for some reason kind of runs out the door. But does that distract from the words of wisdom that are recorded in Proverbs? And I don't think we can discredit. And I mean, there's no way we can't discredit anything in God's word. But I could see some naysayers, like, well, Solomon, he's the wisest man in the world. He lost the kingdom. He wasn't that wise. But if you look at some of none of the Old Testament patriarchs were perfect. We don't tend to discredit any of them. I mean, good grief, if we look at David's life was crazy, and we don't discredit it. So that's kind of a simple point I wanted to make, because we can't discredit that. Solomon stumbled and fell. Micah?
Perhaps, if anything, even with all these men who stumble, but particularly here with Solomon, whether a person stumbles and they're still trying to do God's will, I mean, yeah, it's easy to be on the outside and say, like, yeah, this person was a poor example in their life at times, but ultimately, I think it shows God's mercy in that, yeah, this person messed up and screwed up, but whether they choose to continue to do my will, I still use them. And think about the many chances that God gives us. So if he's willing to give Solomon a chance, and he gives us a chance, and he wants his word still to stay there, we really can't stand against that.
It kind of leads me to like what the next point, and it's a kind of a goofy question. I hesitated to even put it on here, but do you think, did Solomon rectify his situation with God? Tricky, strong question. Yeah, Jessica.
It's a tricky question. We have to kind of look at Ecclesiastes, which we have made the assumption was written by Solomon. We have Proverbs, which we see was written in his earlier life, then we see this written probably at the end of his life. Which I'm going to make the assumption on what I've learned of it is that he probably wrote this after he lost the kingdom.
Ecclesiastes?
It might make sense considering what happened to him.
Yeah.
Like I said, we don't have any proof of that. It's just an assumption. But it seems like there he realized this was all wrong. I made the mistake. And he's admitting he's made mistakes. He says vanity like 36, 37 times in that book.
Yeah.
I think he did, but it took an eye-opener for him to do it.
Yeah, and Jessica makes probably the strongest point there about that, and I'll put a verse from Ecclesiastes up here in a minute, but we know Solomon was a godly man. We know we all stumble and fall short of the glory of God. In Proverbs 11, no, it's 1 Kings 11:4, he didn't completely abandon God. It says his heart was not fully devoted to God. And like Jessica was saying, it's assumed that Ecclesiastes was written later in his life, maybe around, from what I was researching, around 935 BC. But in the book of Ecclesiastes, it's kind of like Solomon kind of is revealing the depression that inevitably results in your life when you're seeking happiness from worldly things. And then if we look at Ecclesiastes 12:13, he kind of concludes it in this manner. He says, the conclusion, when everything has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So I think we can see that it is possible to falter in your wisdom, and a wise person can falter, but it's also possible to bring it back and kind of like what Micah was saying, we have grace, but we still have to go back to that last part of chapter 3 of 1 Kings where it says, keep my commandments. That's kind of always the key there. So finish up here with Solomon, some things that we can learn from Solomon if we were to study him even deeper. When we seek God with all our heart, he will be found. Those who honor God will be honored by him. And if we look at Solomon, we look at his dedication in the key of the temple, he definitely honored God. And I think God definitely honored Solomon by granting him his world-renowned wisdom, the wealth and riches that he had. That wasn't Solomon's doing, that was at the hand of God. Micah?
Something, I don't know if we're going to touch upon this, but in 1 Kings 11:41 it says, now the rest of the acts of Solomon and whatever he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? Is it possible, I don't know for sure, that Proverbs could be some of the acts that he chose? Maybe he didn't talk about himself directly, or even, I don't know if that's part of Ecclesiastes possibly. I mean, we really can't say we know for sure, but is this in reference to those things? Maybe.
11 what?
Sorry, 1 Kings 11 and verse 41, because it talks about the acts of Solomon. Is that indirectly talking about Ecclesiastes and Proverbs if we were to conclude that he is in fact the author of those?
Oh, yeah. Gosh, I couldn't answer that for sure. If it's in referring to the whole compilation of the 3 books that he wrote, I'm not sure.
I think there's maybe no real reason to try to connect it with Proverbs. I mean, there were books, historical books, not inspired, that were written. You read about them in other places.
True.
So there was a history of Solomon.
Yeah, just other writings that he had recorded. God will equip us to accomplish the task he calls us to if we rely on him. And again, it goes back to that, keep my commandments. And as long as we keep his commandments, he will continue to aid us and we can rely upon him. And then when it comes to the fall of Solomon, and I just mentioned this because I hit this pretty hard with the high school class. I think we spent pretty much a lesson talking about it. Those closest to us will affect our spiritual lives. And us as adults in here, we get that. I think we're above me sitting here and talking to you guys about peer pressure. But it's quite applicable when I was talking to the teenagers up there. But still, as adults, we need to think about our peers, our associations, and how do we act? We as Christian brothers and sisters, we know how to act. But when we're out in our worldly positions in work, our worldly volunteering at the school, those things that we're interacting with others of the world, what are we portraying? And how involved are we getting with those people, which there's no problem getting involved in. I mean, all of us have worldly friends. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. There is when we start letting the worldly friends influence us. One thing, you know how the avid mountain biker I am, and every time hey, Sunday morning, man, we're riding out here Sunday morning. It's like, you guys know I'm not coming out here Sunday morning. I'm at church. But how easy to be like, oh, okay, yeah, you know what? I could miss church to go on that ride. I haven't done that trail in a long time. And you start stumbling down that little road, and all of a sudden, there's the negative influence of those that surround you, and it will affect you spiritually. And the perfect example is Solomon. Look how strong and faithful he was, a man of God. And that was his fall, was the foreign women. Any comments or any questions about Solomon before we move on?
Most of First Kings 8 has him praying to the Lord and on his knees and asking for help.
And is that is the where he's dedicating the temple?
First Kings 8.
Yeah. Yeah, that prayer, that's a big old long section of prayer where he is really praising the Lord. Question number 6, who was it written to? And then question number 7, it kind of has the same verses for reference. So I just put basically it's the first 8 verses of Proverbs. And it's really a solid, hey, here's what the book's about. This is pretty solid right here. So who was it written to? Janine?
Knowledge and discretion to the young, it says, and simple.
To the young and what?
Simple.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, right there, there's 2 people, the young and the simple. And we'll spend some time talking about the simple in the next couple lessons. There's 3 kind of characteristics of people that Solomon dictates here, and we'll get into that. But the young, and typically you think of this as a book that we study in the high school class, because man, it's perfect. It's a perfect book to go study in the high school class. But yeah, talks about the young and the simple. The simple are basically those that have not found the Lord yet per se. They haven't completely gone down that path of foolishness, but at the same time, they don't know enough to embark fully in the journey down the path of knowledge either. And we'll spend some time on that. And then we have the key person that I think is his son. If you look down at verse 8, I think it says, listen, my son. So a lot of people, oh, well, that was just a letter Solomon wrote to his son, as he grew up into manhood. But as we look at some of the stuff in here, it's just amazing, all the stuff that Solomon was putting in here. And I think that's why we have a tendency to credit this to the young. But you got to look at verse 5. And verse 5 says, a wise person will hear and increase in learning. And that's kind of the category I'm putting us all in here, is we're wise. And when we start talking about the fool, the simple, and the wise, that's the 3 categories we'll get into. And I believe all of us in here are the category of the wise. And there's some very, very, I've always been impressed at this church here of the Bible knowledge you all have. But there's always the ability to grow. And we know we're supposed to constantly grow in God's Word. So I think it's written to us right here as much as it's written to the kids up in the junior high and high school class. Any comment on that? Who it's written to? Okay, why was it written? And if we go into the first 6 verses there, primarily for gaining wisdom and instruction, to give instruction in prudent behavior, to provide, like Janine said, to knowledge and discretion to the young, to add to the learning and guidance of those that are already wise, and for basic understanding. And so what we'll do in the next 2 lessons is start kind of breaking that down a little bit when we get into discussing wisdom. So in general, some benefits that we get from a study of Proverbs. Proverbs is concerned with the development and assessment of godly character. And the Bible teaches that a man is measured by his character more so than his professed beliefs. And if we look at even 1 Timothy chapter 3, when you look at the qualities or characteristics that should be evident in leadership, deacon, elder position, whatever, and we start seeing those godly characteristics that should be exhibited, above reproach, faithful, self-controlled, gentle, not quarrelsome, and we start looking at those characteristics, And I think Solomon here is telling us the importance of those characteristics. And as you get into each individual proverb, it's kind of beginning to develop those characteristics and how we need to act to gain and develop those characteristics. And to take it a little further, I mean, a godly man is not merely one who professes to believe certain truths, but one who practices them. And I put this big old long verse up here, but I don't even want to go over it because I think we're all familiar with it. And James says about faith and works. And we know that our faith will cause the works to happen, and that we produce fruit. Our faith is known or seen in our works. So it does no good to profess that I'm a godly man. Yes, I'm a godly man. It really doesn't do anything. And we're going to talk a little bit about the tongue. And the tongue is really, I'm trying to think of the word. The tongue is useless to a fool when the fool's just uttering a bunch of nonsense. Oh, I did that. Oh, yeah, I'm a godly man. Well, it should be evident in your actions. Micah?
Going back a little bit to what you're saying, and it's helpful to hear too, isn't it when we stop seeking that knowledge, that we become filled with that kind of, well, arrogant mindset where we think we do know it all? Because I've heard this before, I don't need to be reminded, but that's exactly what we need, because that's the worldly thinking you don't. It's the Father who really knows it all. And like when we stop becoming humble like that, we're just gonna set ourselves up for our next failure.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and that's kind of what we'll kind of discuss here in the next little bit of in our next couple lessons. And like I say, you could have a very, very knowledgeable person that don't have an ounce of wisdom, but then you can have someone that thinks they're so wise that, well, I'm greater than all you, my wisdom, and again, they lose that humbleness. So if you think of our goal as Christians and where we want our character to be and what we want to portray, what do we strive to be most like in our Christian walk? Right, we strive for that idea of being Christ-like. And there's different dimensions of being, Christ-like, but the most essential thing that we can look at when we study Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and how Christ was when he walked the earth is we could strive to be like him in character. And so again, it becomes important that, that Proverbs is a book of character development. In fact, there's probably no book in the Bible that is more dedicated or devoted to the development of godly character than Proverbs. And then, if you look at America right now, there's a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge in the world right now. Is there a lot of wisdom? And I mean, definitely, we'll talk more about that. I mean, wisdom is having knowledge. Wisdom is having knowledge and using it properly. So the world's kind of scary right now. So there's no greater call in the world right now than for the call of godly wisdom and the character of wisdom that needs to be portrayed by what we learn here in Proverbs. Micah?
I agree, because I think there is a lot of knowledge and wisdom, but I think the world's problem is they don't want to admit, well, who is it coming from? Who's really truly revealing it? If they were to humble themselves, if they admit it can't come from just inside of me, it's got to be from someone who put it there, if they had the faith to believe it. I mean, that's why we're here, because we believe God's the one who reveals it all, because that's what he says in his word. But the world doesn't want to see it because they have to think of someone higher than themselves. So for us, like that's why part of why we're here, because we can't go through this life without the Father.
Yeah.
We need his instruction.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we'll see wisdom and knowledge comes from God. And those that are worldly, that may not have a belief in God anyways, just cannot acknowledge that, well, can't come from God. Is there a God? You know, that's the worldly thought, yeah. Justin?
The Bible, I go back to the idea like of worldly wisdom. There's a phrase that's used in multiple places, Jeremiah and others, that they call being wise in your own eyes.
Yes, yes.
That's the worldly wisdom.
Yeah.
Is they have some knowledge and they know stuff, but the application of it and what they pursue in life, kind of without the Lord, that falls into the category of being wise in your own eyes.
Right, and that's one of the, I'll use that very scripture there when we talk about that's the way of the fool. You know, they're wise in their own eyes. Something that is also, Proverbs also does is it teaches the idea of discernment and being able to discern character, build character in ourselves, yet also discern character of others, and being able to distinguish between the wise and the foolish. And it's most applicable when we talk about the simple, the character of the simple, because they're at that crossroads. It could be a new convert, it could be our youth, it could maybe be someone that's a strong Christian that's struggling, but they're at that crossroads and they're like, oh, I'm going to leer off over here to the path of foolishness. And we need to be able to discern the wise man and the fool. And like for an example of discernment, in Proverbs 22:6, it says, train up a child in the way he should go. And we'll talk, one of our subjects will be about family and raising children and whatnot. And if you have a child that disobeys because they simply didn't understand the rule, they didn't listen carefully, they should be disciplined differently than a child that heard the rule, understood it, it's been an ongoing issue, and he repeatedly just blatantly does it out of willful disrespect. Okay? Discernment would tell you deal with those two things differently. And that's just a simple example I use about the word about discernment. But we need to be able to discern the character of our friends. We need to be able to discern the character of our associates. Obviously, there's simple proverbs in here that those who are violent and wicked should obviously be avoided. Those who are dishonest should not be business partners with. But to some degree, there's some discernment. And I'm not talking about judging or condemning or anything, but basic common sense and using discretion. And that's something I think is big in Proverbs too, is that along with the acquirement of knowledge and the development of wisdom is we have to learn discretion. So Proverbs teaches us to be wise. And that's the point, as I made it already, about there's tons of knowledge in the world, but is there discretion in that knowledge? How much wisdom is there? You know, there's an explosion of knowledge in the world with the internet and anything you want to find and look. I got a big car project going on tomorrow that I'm gonna do something to the wife's car, and wherever I get that knowledge, YouTube. Oh, I've watched this on YouTube. I've watched this video 3 times, Barbara. I think I can pull this off. About 2 hours later, hey, Justin. I think I got it, though. But yeah, there's a lot of knowledge in the world, and it's just tossed out there free. Here, knowledge, knowledge, knowledge. Where's that knowledge coming from? Where's the true knowledge? Where's the real knowledge that's going to save our soul? Micah? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. No, it's a good point. I think Proverbs also helps us to look at life realistically. Proverbs does a good job of looking at worldly situations and how we should respond to them. How does the fool respond to this? how does the wise person respond to this? And it kind of it encourages us to see men for who they are and what they are, and to recognize sin for what it is. And it also kind of gives the idea that that whole thing, ignorance is bliss. Well, that's where the simple is. He's still in that ignorance is bliss. But when you start converting, when you get into that path of wisdom, that whole idea of, oh, I didn't know you couldn't do that. And it doesn't work anymore. And Proverbs is pretty good about saying, hey, as we're making that transition and going down this path of wisdom and staying far away from the path of foolishness, that ignorance is bliss is kind of out the window. Being naive is no excuse. This was an interesting thing I came across, and I hadn't really ever thought about it, but if you look at the teachings of Solomon here in Proverbs, and we talked about how unique they are, they're most like the teachings of Christ. And Christ using parables. And Solomon here, it's like I say, it's not a typical chapter by chapter, verse by verse, but Solomon uses these parables so that it will invoke our thought and invoke some inquiry. You got to kind of think about them for a minute. And that's exactly like the parables that Jesus used. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I got to speed up here. What is a proverb? Any comments? What is a proverb?
Just a saying, isn't it?
That's pretty. Yeah. That's basically. I got a whole bunch of a paragraph like that, and in the bottom part of that paragraph is basically Proverbs are saying. Janine.
A simple but insightful expression.
Yes. Jessica.
My commentary said seeks to state a general, not absolute truth.
Okay, yeah, a general, not absolute truth, but it's definitely something that can be deducted from it and applied. And a good example, instead of going through my whole thing on Proverbs here, here's 3 Proverbs. And one of the reasons I decided not to do a verse by verse, chapter by chapter, verse by verse is these are 3 Proverbs that apply to the same exact thing. And you see we've got them in verse 12, or chapter 12, chapter 15, chapter 18, and that's just 3. And this is talking about the tongue. We'll spend one night talking about speech and the things we say and whatnot. And Proverbs is just riddled with all these types of sayings. And so you start going chapter by chapter, verse by verse, it's going to become repetitive because you're going to see the same theme. But if you take these 3 Proverbs, one thing you notice, most of them are only 2 lines. In fact, as I didn't go through here text by text. It's like, oh, no, there's one that's 4. But for the most part, every one of these in here is 2 lines. They're short, they're simple, they're precise and to the point, and it's like an economy of words, okay? And you can see in here, to prove that point, here's 3 things about what the wise man says and what the foolish man says. A prudent man conceals knowledge. He's quiet, he's conserved, he's not, bestow thy knowledge, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's not the wise man, okay? Is that the fool? Yeah, the fool's always running his mouth. But the heart of fools proclaims folly. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer. Thinking about it, reserved, calculated. What's going to come out as my response is going to be an educated, knowledgeable, wise answer. The fool, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. A fool does not delight in understanding, but only in revealing his own mind. So I throw those 3 up there because I think it gives it a perfect example of what a proverb is and kind of how it's used, and it does a good point of those 3 proverbs talk about how keeping it short, simple and concise, and choosing your words wisely. Real quick, kind of a main theme of Proverbs, and all this is in the first 9 chapters. The first 9 chapters really kind of sums up and hits hard where Proverbs is going to go. But Proverbs 4:5, get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget my words or swerve from them. That's one of probably the most key thing that we're going to find in this study is get wisdom, get understanding, acquire those things. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline, and then we'll get into that next week. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and I think it was a point that Micah had made, is like, where do we get our knowledge? And kind of makes me think of what he was saying. If you look at the world, where do we get our knowledge from? Fear of the Lord, from the Lord. Okay, can the worldly people accept that? No. Knowledge comes from YouTube and the science book and this article that this atheist wrote. And so that gets right into why the fool despises wisdom and discipline. Proverbs 1:5, let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. Proverbs 8:13 through 14, to fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior and perverse speech. Counsel and sound judgment are mine. I have understanding and power. And I apologize because I have my NIV Bible, and I feel awkward turning my back to you and reading that, so lesson learned for next week. Because if I read out of my Bible, it's going to be different than that. Question number 9, and I kind of hesitated to put this one up there, but it's got some points worthy of bringing up. I said read Proverbs chapter 8, and then particularly verse 22 through 36, then read 1 Corinthians 1:30. What do these verses tell you about wisdom? And so there's the whole part about Proverbs 8:22 through 36. And we're going to spend some time referencing or looking deeper at that verse 1 through 22 in a couple Wednesdays. But I think if you look at chapter 8 and if you took the time and you read that, man, that right there kind of summarizes the whole point of where Proverbs is going. And if you read that, did anyone read that? And what were there some similarities to something that brought attention to you? Found there in Proverbs chapter 8. You start looking at the characteristics and what is described there, Ian.
Maybe I'm not answering what you asked for. It sounds like a passage from Job.
Which one?
You're talking about this.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, right, okay, all right. I was thinking it kind of sounds like it's talking about Christ. But I didn't want to go down the road, and we can talk about it later, but that's basically the characteristics that are described there in that chapter are very Christ-like characteristics. And what Solomon is doing there is he's using like literary, like in Ian's class, perfect example of personification. Chapter 8 is wisdom, and I talked a minute ago about Solomon and how he uses women in portraying some of his writing here. And this chapter 8 is a perfect example of it, where he personifies wisdom as this woman, and then lists all these characters there. And if you look at verse 14, that's when I don't have it up there. That was the early part of the reading. It says, "Wisdom is a divine virtue possessed by God," and that's the key bottom line there. Is wisdom is a divine virtue possessed by God. And then if you take that idea, Solomon is simply personifying wisdom as this female. And then if you look at that, wisdom personified here in chapter 8 finds its perfect New Testament expression in Jesus Christ. And then 2 more scriptures and we'll be done here. Because we know Jesus is our access to wisdom. Colossians 2, and it's the last part of verse 2, says, "That is Christ himself, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge." And so, things that are true of a divine virtue should be evident of a divine person. So we see that divine virtue of wisdom in Christ. And then if we look at 1 Corinthians 1:30, but it is due to him that you're in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So those things of wisdom are provided and access to us, available to us through Christ. And that's my final point for tonight, and I appreciate you listening to me, and look forward to next week. Thank you.